The Vietnam War has been over for 7 years. In 1982, America symbolically comes to terms with this bloody and divisive engagement when the Vietnam Memorial is commemorated in Washington, D.C. America's scars are slowly healing, but the memory of Vietnam remains. And around the world, the agony and waste of war is repeated on many fronts, adding thousands of new names to the list of the lost. In Central America, communist-backed forces in Nicaragua and El Salvador battle U.S. allies. In Iran and Iraq, massive border battles are waged throughout the year. In the tiny Falkland Islands, war breaks out between England and Argentina. And in Lebanon, 3 decades of hatred between Israelis and Palestinians again erupts into a fiery showdown over territory and security. The seeds of the Mideast conflict of 1982 can be traced back to the tragic Holocaust of World War II. The death of 6 million Jews at the hands of the Nazis motivated the victorious European powers to help Jewish survivors establish a new nation in their ancient homeland. Many nations were in favor of the new country, but the long-established Palestinian population and its Arab neighbors vehemently opposed the Jewish occupation of Palestine. In 1948, the State of Israel was born and was immediately attacked by the Arab states of Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. Thousands of Palestinians fled into exile in neighboring Muslim nations, preferring to continue to wage war against Israel. And the Palestine Liberation Organization, a militant force committed to regaining its homeland, was born. In 1970, tensions escalate when Jordan expels the strong PLO from its borders. Thousands of PLO soldiers settle in camps in southern Lebanon, camps dedicated to training future Palestinian guerrillas. Lebanon was the last possible refuge for the PLO. While the cosmopolitan capital of Beirut was called the Paris of the Mideast, Lebanon had a weak army and was governed by a fragile coalition of Christians and Muslims. The harmony crumbled when the PLO began attacking Christian villages in the mid-70s. Civil war broke out between the PLO, backed by Syria, and various Christian militias, backed and financed by Israel.
We are facing one enemy, and we have to get rid of this enemy. There is no way to negotiate with this enemy. The only way is to finish with him.
Bravo.
The leader of the PLO is Yasser Arafat.
We are the victims, and we are insisting not to give these cards to our enemies.
And the PLO continues to escalate its terrorist activity against Israel. Then, in London on June 3rd, 1982, the PLO guns down the Israeli ambassador to England. 3 days later, the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, invade southern Lebanon by air, sea, and land to finally wipe out the PLO strongholds used for waging attacks against Israel's northern borders.
We will not accept a situation which will allow the terrorist organization to keep our civilian settlers along the northern border as hostages.
The aim of Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon is to establish a 25-mile zone within Lebanon free of the PLO. With its superior firepower, it takes Israel just 4 days to march through and contain southern Lebanon. Then Sharon makes the crucial decision one that is unpopular with many of his allies, to push north and pursue Arafat into Beirut. It is the first time Israel has ever invaded an Arab capital. But Israel's blow at the PLO leaves over 200,000 civilians homeless or injured.
They thought that they can, quote unquote, solve the PLO problem by sheer brutal force. They thought it's a military problem. They are all, quote unquote, terrorists, all of them. Eventually, what they would do with the women, children, old people, I don't think they thought.
By mid-June, the army surrounds Muslim West Beirut. Inside, the PLO political leadership and 6,000 soldiers are trapped.
I think the Sharon is preparing for something new. Well, tell him I'm waiting for him with this small and beautiful baby.
And the heavily armed but outnumbered PLO lays in for the siege. Israeli shelling intensifies, and 500,000 civilians are directly at risk.
West Beirut is closed. It's hermetically sealed, comparatively speaking. Certainly from a military point of view, it's hermetically sealed. And therefore, they don't have many options, the PLO.
We came here only for one purpose, and that is to destroy. And take this word, to destroy the terrorist PLO Palestinian organizations. We are not fighting the Palestinian people.
With nearly 35,000 people already dead in Lebanon, Ambassador Philip Habib is sent by President Ronald Reagan to negotiate an end to the bloodshed. But diplomatic efforts are more difficult than expected. While many Arab governments supply the PLO with arms and money, none of them wants to give refuge to the 6,000 well-trained guerrillas. In Britain, a surprise war forces Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to live up to her reputation.
The Russians said that I was an Iron Lady.
Yeah.
They were right.
Thatcher faces the biggest political challenge of her career when Argentina's president, General Leopoldo Galtieri, orders the invasion of the tiny Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. The barren and rocky Falklands, once owned by Argentina at the beginning of the last century, have been under British control since 1833. Argentina wants control again, but Galtieri gives up on diplomatic negotiations and turns to a military solution when he sends 5,000 Argentinian troops to seize the islands and their 1,800 residents. London is shocked and humiliated by Argentina's unexpected aggression.
Our objective is to recover the Falkland Islands. We have to do what is necessary to that. I wouldn't talk in terms of war. Declaration of war is something different. Let's not get into the technicalities. We must recover the Falkland Islands for Britain and for the people who live there, who are of British stock.
But Thatcher reacts swiftly and decisively, demanding Argentina's withdrawal before any negotiations begin, and sending a large naval task force to the Falklands to back up her words. But General Galtieri refuses to cooperate. Hoping to solve the deadlock between two allies, President Reagan sends Secretary of State Alexander Haig to negotiate an end to the crisis. Shuttling between London and Buenos Aires, Haig spends 3 frustrating weeks trying to avert a military conflict. But Argentina refuses to withdraw its troops, and Britain still refuses to talk while the islands are occupied.
We appreciate enormously the help that has been given by President Reagan to forestall this simply ridiculous and very dangerous situation, because if it goes on, a lot of people are going to get killed.
The United Nations is no more successful than the U.S. at solving the problem.
I must tell you that many difficult problems still remain. We have had our hopes raised several times before, only to be dashed.
Finally, Haig exhausts his efforts to achieve a peaceful solution, claiming Argentina won't compromise. Then, to no one's surprise, Reagan drops his neutral position and throws America's support behind Margaret Thatcher.
The aggression was on the part of Argentina in this dispute over the sovereignty of that little ice-cold bunch of land down there, and they finally just resorted to armed aggression, and there was bloodshed.
The government, in its attempts to find a diplomatic solution, has done nothing which forecloses any military action now or any military option for the future. Nothing is being held up because we are negotiating.
After an 8,000-mile, 3-week voyage from home, Britain's naval armada of some 60 ships now surrounds the Falklands.
At the moment, I'm utterly broken-hearted. I can't bear the thought of an Argentine being killed by a Britisher, because my feelings are entirely towards the Argentine and my blood is British.
In early May, a British submarine torpedoes the General Belgrano, and 400 Argentinian sailors perish in the icy seas. 3 days later, an Argentinian jet destroys the Sheffield by firing just one French-made Exocet missile.
The right-hand ship is Sheffield.
For weeks, both sides maneuver at sea, where Britain has superiority, and in the air, where Argentina has the edge. Then, Britain lands 1,000 Royal Marine Commandos on West Falkland Island, securing a beachhead for more troops.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain Dent, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman.
Many more lives are lost by the British
Corporal Fryer, Lance Corporal Thorpe,
and the Argentinians. In England, Thatcher's public standing soars because of her tough military stance, repairing her unpopular image caused by 2 years of harsh economic policies. But in Argentina, citizens are stunned by the mounting death toll. Some believe Galtieri started the conflict to divert national attention away from domestic chaos and an economy saddled with a 135% annual inflation rate. With 8,000 men now on the Falklands, the British launch a concerted offensive in their quest to gain control of the capital of Port Stanley, where 7,000 Argentinian soldiers hold the city. First, they seize the towns of Goose Green and Darwin.
You had one big battle already at Goose Green. You learned any lessons from that?
Learned a lot of lessons.
What sort of things?
Well, fighting through. Just keep on going. There's no stop, no turning back. It's just straight through.
The Marines then gain the vital high ground around Stanley.
The tumble-down feature was to be approached by the Scots-Guards using Goose Ridge here. And then they were to take that. Having gone firm on that, the Gurkhas were supposed to go from Tumbledown, having passed through the Scots-Guards, and then into Mount William. It was obviously a rather nasty battle.
3 weeks after the land battles begin, the cornered Argentinian soldiers finally surrender.
Gentlemen, I have just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley. Ready?
The victorious soldiers are cheered on by the liberated Falklanders. Weeks later, the triumphant soldiers return to a joyous reunion.
Failure? Do you remember what Queen Victoria once said? Failure? The possibilities do not exist.
And in Buenos Aires, defeated General Galtieri resigns in disgrace. In Washington, another kind of battle is being waged against the faltering economy, and Reagan's promised economic recovery is on shaky ground.
During the presidential campaign, your presidential campaign, you asked an extremely effective question of the American people. And it went like this: are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? So it seems only fair to ask this question at this time. With high unemployment, high interest rates, an increasing number of business failures, and a generally bleak economy, are Americans really better off today than they were when you became president?
Yes, unemployment has increased because of the recession. But I would remind you that we had almost as much. We had in the neighborhood of 8 million unemployed back then, before we came here. We had interest rates of 21.5%. Well, they're 16. That's still too high. And it is those high interest rates that are delaying our coming out of this recession.
President Reagan has to grapple with one of the worst economic messes in decades, and many people blame his conservative fiscal policies and the sweeping tax reductions passed in 1981.
When Mr. Reagan came to town, he came announcing that he had a theory that was new and unconventional that would solve all of our problems. It's now called Reaganomics. He won every bit of what he wanted, and within a week or two, this economy started straight downhill.
Many Republicans are very sensible people, and how could they be pleased with an economic policy which has produced the worst unemployment, the worst wave of bankruptcies, the worst transfer of income from average people to the very wealthy since Depression days?
But Reagan blames his predecessors for the deepening deficit and poor economic conditions.
Our current economic troubles are the direct result of the mistakes of the past. Mistakes that we're working to correct. We've begun to rescue this economy, and the first evidence of recovery has been cited, but it's only a beginning.
The reason for the deficits being as high as they are is dual. First, because of the excessive Reagan tax cut for the wealthy, and secondly, because of the Reagan recession.
As the politicians snipe, most Americans are suffering from the double blow of high inflation and high interest rates.
Prices are going up more than ever now.
The percentage of prices have went up. An average pair of shoes I was just shopping for here in the mall was $10 cheaper last year, and I think that's quite a large increase. My lifestyle has changed because of inflation. I believe Reagan is concentrating more on defense, and therefore inflation has really hit us because of that. I believe he's concentrating on the defense more of the country.
To fund the massive military buildup, Reagan slashes vital social programs. The effects of these cutbacks, along with the 16% interest rates, begin to take a toll across the nation. By December, unemployment hits the highest mark since 1940. 12 million people are now out of work. Yet one sector of the economy is beginning to revive. In mid-August, the stock market rallies at the news that interest rates are finally declining. Over the next 5 months, Wall Street breaks records, sending the Dow Jones Index of Stocks soaring over the 1,000-point mark for the first time in history.
It could be that they think that Reaganomics is starting to work. That could be it. It could be, what is it, the slogan, stay with the program? That could be into vogue right, and that could be coming into vogue right now. Maybe people are starting to believe that President Reagan's economic policies are starting to work.
Optimism returns to Wall Street, but not to Main Street.
I know when I go to work, I see the lines get bigger and bigger outside the unemployment office. And about the last few months, they've practically doubled. A lot of people are suffering.
And in an act that will come to haunt all Americans, President Reagan signs into law the Savings and Loan Deregulation Bill of 1982.
What this legislation does is expand the powers of thrift institutions by permitting the industry to make commercial loans and increase their consumer lending. It reduces their exposure to changes in the housing market and in interest rate levels. This, in turn, will make the thrift industry a stronger, more effective force in financing housing for millions of Americans in the years to come. This bill is the most important legislation for financial institutions in the last 50 years. It provides a long-term solution for troubled thrift institutions. It's pro-consumer, granting small savers greater access to loans, a higher return on their savings, and when combined with recent sharp declines in interest rates, it means help for housing, more jobs, and new growth for the economy. All in all, I think we hit the jackpot.
Reagan's jackpot leads to wholesale incompetence and fraud among thrift owners nationwide, causing hundreds of S&Ls to go bankrupt later in the 80s and laying the groundwork for a financial debacle that will reverberate for decades. Disaster strikes during a rare Washington, D.C. snowstorm when an ice-covered Air Florida jet crashes, first into a crowded bridge and finally into the frigid waters of the Potomac River. Tragically, 74 passengers and 4 motorists are killed, but many are saved by the heroism of others. The helicopter rescue team that plucked survivors from the river. The unidentified passenger who hands the rope to others before disappearing beneath the surface. And Lenny Skutnik, the passerby, who plunges into the 30-degree water to save a dazed and frozen flight attendant.
Just 2 weeks ago, in the midst of a terrible tragedy on the Potomac, we saw again the spirit of American heroism at its finest. The heroism of dedicated rescue workers saving crash victims from icy waters. And we saw the heroism of one of our young government employees, Lenny Skutnik, who, when he saw a woman lose her grip on the helicopter line, dived into the water and dragged her to safety.
The Equal Rights Amendment dies in 1982, marking the end of a 10-year struggle to ensure sexual equality in the Constitution. Public opinion is in favor of the ERA, and 35 states have ratified. But the campaign ends in an uphill battle to get 3 more predominantly male state legislatures to pass the amendment.
We have survived a 10-year battle where we have been laughed at and ridiculed by the men in this chamber.
But there are other powerful forces against the ERA. The Stop ERA movement, led by homemaker Phyllis Schlafly, sends an emotional charge through the country. They argue that ERA is pro-abortion, anti-family, and will send women into combat.
If the Equal Rights Amendment passes, we'd have no choice. Under the draft, women would be drafted and forced into combat.
And the president is staunchly against it.
The club begins a new era. That's ERA, not ERA.
ERA supporters have a tough time keeping the debate focused on what they see as ERA's main goal, economic equality for women who in 1982 earned 59 cents to every man's dollar.
As a registered nurse, Carol makes less than men who fix cars, drive buses, or trim trees. That's why Carol wants the Equal Rights Amendment ratified.
There is confusion over ERA's intent. Many are in favor of equality, but against the ERA.
I mean, I want the money, you know, for the job, but I wouldn't want to go into the service, so I don't know if you would call that like a split decision or what.
I'm not for it. I'm for equal pay, you know, in the work they do and stuff, but I just like the way things are now.
ERA supporters vow to continue the fight and say they have learned from the losing battle. Next time, they say, the battle will be fought on a different front.
There is a strong incentive across the country to build a political operation, a much more political operation. What does that mean? It means not just lobbying in the legislature or the Congress. It means putting women into these bodies so that we're not faced again 10 years from now or 20 years from now with having to go to an all-male Congress, basically, or an all-male legislature.
Many of 1982's box office hits reflect the political uncertainty of the year. British filmmakers receive an Oscar for their film portrayal of Gandhi, the charismatic leader who paved the way for India's independence. Sylvester Stallone explodes onto the screen, and with this first in a series of films, the word Rambo enters the English language.
Would you like to get a drink?
Sure.
He's a Navy officer, she's a working girl. Actors Richard Gere and Deborah Winger fall in love in An Officer and a Gentleman.
Are you saying that nobody in New York will work with me?
Oh, no, that's too limited. Nobody in Hollywood wants to work with you either.
And he finds being a gentleman isn't helping his acting career. So actor Dustin Hoffman dresses up as a lady in Tootsie. The most popular film of the year was E.T. Director Steven Spielberg's extraterrestrial character won the heart of a little boy and the hearts of millions of moviegoers worldwide. In Chicago, the hunt for an indiscriminate killer raises fears about the safety of over-the-counter drugs. 7 innocent people in an Illinois suburb die before the cause is determined.
Tylenol capsules that were taken from the victim's apartment are positive, and that cyanide was found in these capsules.
I believe that name Tylenol is dead for all intents and purposes. I mean, I'm sure it'll be around. They're not going to take the name off the market, but I would think within a year it's going to be very tough to find any product with the name Tylenol on it, unfortunately.
But Johnson & Johnson responds swiftly to save lives and its good name. Within 24 hours, all Tylenol products are pulled from the shelves.
Tylenol has had the trust of the medical profession and 100 million Americans for over 20 years. We value that trust too much to let any individual tamper with it. We want you to continue to trust Tylenol.
Then, a letter demanding $1 million from Tylenol to stop the killings leads to the arrest of James Lewis, later convicted of extortion, but not of the Tylenol deaths. By the end of the year, Tylenol is reintroduced with new tamper-resistant packaging, soon to become a mandatory industry-wide standard.
We don't know what's causing all of this, and somehow so many of your own personal friends. Why is it that we know so many of them? There must be 1 million gay people in the New York City area. Of the 350-some cases, why do we know so many of the people? It's a great medical puzzle.
In labs across the country, the race continues to find the cause of another deadly killer, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. As the rate of new cases rises sharply, mounting evidence focuses the search on sexual and blood transmissions.
It's certainly not an airborne disease, not something that spreads in the subway or the buses. It's spread, if it is contagious, which we don't know really, but if it is a contagious agent, then it is transmitted by very, very close personal contact.
Hi, Bill.
Hi.
Hi, this is Roger McFarland from the Gay Men's Health Crisis.
Oh, hi.
Hardest hit is the gay community, which begins to take responsibility among its members to prevent the spread of the disease.
We have to get the information around. We're putting out a leaflet that says, guys, until we know better, cool it. Give up your drugs, lay off the number of people you're having sex with until we know better.
But in a real breakthrough, at the University of Utah Medical Center, successful testing of an artificial heart brings the medical community closer to the implantation of the Jarvik 7.
The hearts can themselves last 2 or 3 years as they are now. As we make the system truly portable, then we believe it will serve a very large number of patients that cannot be reached with heart transplants.
Some doctors believe that society is unprepared to answer the ethical questions related to the pioneering effort.
After all, what is the heart? The site of love, the symbol of life, and the habitat of the soul. And take that away and replace it by a mechanical pump. It's just so far outside of the way of thinking of a lot of people.
On December 2nd, with only hours to live with his own deteriorating heart, 61-year-old Barney Clark becomes the first human to receive the polyurethane and aluminum heart. The 7.5-hour operation is considered a success.
The patient is on his own artificial heart. He has a blood pressure equivalent to an 18-year-old man and essentially doing very well.
Recovery is difficult for the former dentist, who spends the next 2 months at the hospital. Returning home to his family in February 1983, he speaks with his surgeon, Dr. DeVries.
All in all, it's been a pleasure to be able to help people, and maybe you folks learn something.
But on March 23rd, 1983, the sad news comes.
Dr. Barney Clark died this evening at 10:02 p.m. The doctors are listing his cause of death as circulatory collapse.
The quest for a healthy body reaches new heights in 1982 with a fitness craze that consumes the nation. While America sweats, Jane Fonda's workout book rests comfortably on the bestseller lists all year. And aerobics, jazzercise, and Nautilus work their way into everyday vocabulary. Working out is not just good for you, it's chic and expensive. The beautiful people spend billions of dollars to achieve that beautiful body. Threats of violence simmer in Central America throughout 1982, dragging the U.S. further into the turmoil. In El Salvador, for 2 years, the U.S.-backed right-wing government is responsible for the deaths of thousands of civilians, prompting critics in America to demand that Reagan suspend aid. Yet the president insists that El Salvador is headed in the right direction, pointing to the successes in U.S. military training and free national elections. But the elections are held under clouds of suspicion and violence. The left-wing opposition refuses to put candidates on the ballot for fear of their lives. On election day, left-wing rebels terrorize voting stations. Chaos reigns, and the validity of the elections is in serious doubt. Next door, in Nicaragua, Marxist leader Daniel Ortega accuses the U.S. of backing a right-wing fighting force that is trying to overthrow his government. As rebel attacks reveal military sophistication, Ortega's accusations gain credence. Congress outlaws military aid to the rebels, and the Reagan administration denies any direct involvement.
The United States is not in Nicaragua in any training capacity. There are people in Nicaragua apparently who don't like what is going on there, but that is not anything that we're training them for.
Back in Lebanon, Israel keeps tightening the noose around the PLO in West Beirut, cutting off water, food, and fuel. In late July, Israel begins another fierce bombing attack to bring the PLO to its knees. American reaction is muted.
We want the exodus of the armed PLO out of Beirut and out of Lebanon. Mr. Habib has been making a tour of countries to see if we can get some help in temporary staging areas for those people. We want the central government of Lebanon to once again, after several years of almost dissolution, to once again be the authority with a military force, not several militias belonging to various factions in Lebanon. And then we want the foreign forces, Israeli and Syrian both, out of Lebanon.
By early August, Habib finally gets 6 Arab countries to accept divisions of the PLO army. In return, a multinational peacekeeping force is to arrive as the PLO guerrillas are evacuated.
Ambassador Habib has informed me that a plan to resolve the West Beirut crisis has been agreed upon by all the parties involved. As part of this plan, the government of Lebanon has requested, and I have approved, the deployment of United States forces to Beirut as part of a multinational force.
Back in Lebanon, where the Constitution stipulates that the nation's leader will always be a Christian, Bashir Gemayel, the leader of the strong Christian phalangists, is elected the country's new president. Gemayel's staunch anti-PLO position makes him popular with a majority of Lebanese.
We always kept saying that Lebanon is easy to eat, but very difficult to digest and almost impossible to digest. The Syrians and the Palestinians didn't understood all that. They kept playing tricks in Lebanon. They kept playing with the fire in Lebanon. We kept telling them, don't. We kept telling them, Lebanon will never be a spare homeland for the Palestinians. They never understood, and here we are.
Go, Marines! By the end of August, 800 U.S. Marines, plus soldiers from France and Italy, land in Lebanon to secure safe passage for the departing PLO guerrillas and provide security for civilians.
Are you worried about your safety here?
That's my job, you know. In a way, yes. No, we're Marines. We don't worry.
You're not kidding?
No, we have no concern at all. We feel that this is going to go smoothly.
With fanfare more appropriate for victory rather than defeat, all 6,000 PLO soldiers leave Beirut in a blaze of gunfire. And not wanting to risk American lives further, Reagan withdraws the Marines 2 weeks ahead of schedule. For a brief moment, peace reigns in Beirut, but it is shattered in mid-September when Arab terrorists assassinate President-elect Bashir Gemayel. Israeli troops and Christian militias immediately seal off West Beirut again to restore peace and security. Then, the massacre at Sabra and Shatila.
All the direct or implicit accusations that the IDF bear any blame whatsoever for this human tragedy in the Shatila camp are entirely baseless and without any foundation.
For 2 days, over 600 defenseless Palestinian men, women, and children are slaughtered by Christian Phalangist militiamen in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila.
They told us clearly that they are going to go into the refugees camp. We even filmed some of the commanders, one of the commanders giving instructions to his soldiers. We asked them, of course, what are you going to do in the camps? And they made some gestures with their hands. Well, something that
Allowed into the camps with the knowledge of the Israeli army, the Christians retaliate for Jamal's assassination and settle a bitter blood feud with the Palestinians. And for nearly 2 days, the Israeli army surrounding the camps does nothing to end the tragedy. Reaction is swift and harsh. As the protector of Beirut, the Israeli government comes under intense criticism from within its own parliament. A week later, over 400,000 Israelis march in Tel Aviv to register their outrage and call for the resignations of Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Defense Minister Ariel Sharon. Stunned by the attacks, a weakened Begin reluctantly calls for an official inquiry. And in February 1983, the government report states that Sharon bore personal responsibility for the massacre at Sabra and Shatila, and he is dismissed from his post. Back in America, Reagan is rebuilding America's nuclear arsenal, but a movement to rid the world of its most deadly weapons is growing. Across the U.S. and across the Atlantic, massive rallies make the No Nukes activists a political force to be reckoned with. In 1982, 37 years after the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, President Reagan's plan to update and escalate NATO's already huge nuclear stockpiles ignites fear and outrage worldwide. In New York's Central Park, hundreds of thousands join entertainers and public figures in voicing their concerns.
We are here today because we believe that human survival and prosperity requires a nuclear arms freeze. We are here because we believe the concept of limited nuclear war must be abandoned. And we are here because we can no longer allow a suicidal nuclear arms race to drain the world economy.
In Pasadena, the cause is of massive proportions.
The peace movement lives again in America. We shall march until there is no more war and no more weapons. We want peace now and peace forever.
And at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, 1,300 demonstrators are arrested for disrupting operations. Still, the administration continues to deploy new nuclear weapons.
Now, the air-launched cruise missile will put a great stress on the Soviet air defense system.
Civil defense became obsolete early in the 1970s when the number and power of existing weapons made the concept of surviving a nuclear war unimaginable. However, the Reagan administration thinks otherwise, and many Americans are terrified when he reestablishes a civil defense program which plans for life after a nuclear attack.
It would be a terrible mess, but it wouldn't be unmanageable.
If we learned more about it and took kind of classes or things like that, then if we were prepared, I think we could probably get through one.
I think it's scary because a lot of people would be killed, probably me too.
I have no idea what we could do, what I would do with the last 20 minutes of my life if I knew in 20 minutes I would no longer exist.
While Americans are just finding their voice, the most fervent anti-nuclear protests are in Europe, where much of the U.S. arsenal is based. Ridding the world of the nuclear threat is a global issue transcending age and nationality.
Did you ask Britons whether they want American missiles stationed in Britain? Did you ask anybody in Europe whether they want to be a battleground, a frontline battlefield for what's essentially the American leadership's idea of a war?
Listen to the peace bird, pretty and bright. Stop and think before you start to fight. Fighting is not nice. Fighting is not right. So listen to the peace bird, pretty and bright.
Throughout the 80s, Poles are seeking not only peace, but freedom, and another year of confrontation between the communist government and the Solidarity trade union leads to violence in the streets. In May, demonstrators and police clash in Warsaw, and under martial law, thousands are arrested. The government of Wojciech Jaruzelski is beset by a fast declining food supply and Solidarity's demands for a larger voice in the running of Poland. Then, on the second anniversary of Solidarity's formation, new strikes and riots erupt. And in a stunning blow to freedom, the communists vote to outlaw the Solidarity Union. In November, Union leader Lech Walesa is freed after spending 11 months in detention. But his power is diminished, and Solidarity's future as the only strong voice against communist domination is now on shaky ground. Then, the communist world is faced with a major transition when 75-year-old Leonid Brezhnev dies in November. As General Secretary of the Soviet Union's Communist Party, Brezhnev led the Kremlin for 18 years. Leonid Brezhnev was a child of the Russian Revolution, the direct successor to the men who overthrew the Tsar. He was not as brilliant as Lenin, not as terrifying as Stalin, nor as shrewd as Khrushchev. But personally, he was more persuasive as a world leader. Brezhnev eased tensions with the United States over the years, but was always watched carefully by Washington.
President Nixon, tell us about Chairman Brezhnev, the man. Did you like him?
Well, I would say I liked him as an individual, as a person, or perhaps should I say as a Russian. You know, despite my combat with Russians, Khrushchev and Brezhnev and so forth, the Russians as people are warm, in his case very physical, very emotional, marvelous sense of humor. That's where he was like Khrushchev, too. And so as an individual, I did like him. Now, as a communist leader, however, he was tough. He was ruthless. Anytime he gave an opening, he'd go right in there. He would create them. You had to watch him every minute. And I would say in liking him that way, I didn't like him much, but I had to respect him.
Respect was gained with the barrel of a gun. In the 60s and 70s, Brezhnev orchestrated the largest military buildup in world history, forcing American presidents to follow his lead. But Brezhnev's huge spending on arms severely depressed the Soviets' industrial and agricultural production, sowing the seeds for future economic and political crises. Brezhnev's passing marks the beginning of extraordinary changes within the USSR. The old guard temporarily wins out with the selection of Yuri Andropov as the new leader. But the tremendous problems already surfacing with the economy and with Solidarity's push for freedom in Poland later forced the communists to choose a younger, more daring leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who will be forced to let the Soviet Empire unravel, a move considered inconceivable in 1982.
Let's understand one thing. You're not going to see the Russians agree to let Poland become non-communist. They can't let that happen because then the whole empire would come apart.
We'll always have Paris. We didn't have, we lost it until you came to Casablanca. We got it back last night.
And I said I would never leave you.
We're working the day watch out of Homicide Division. My partner's Frank Smith. The boss is Captain Lorman. My name's Friday.
I adore Napoleon, too.
Little princess.
I want to hear you call me by my name.
Ethel, listen. The loons. They come around to say goodbye.
We was having so much fun. I didn't know it was 1:30.
In the chill of November in Washington, Americans finally joined together to pay homage to the men and women who lost their lives in the Vietnam War, and to show the first public recognition to the veterans who were so poorly served by their country when they returned from combat.
For 10 years, this nation struggled in Southeast Asia. 2,700,000 American men and women participated in the armed forces in that struggle, and 57,939 did not return. That war divided this nation. It divided the hearts and souls of those who fought and of those who mourned.
Oh, beautiful for heroes proved.
For the survivors, there is an emotional reconciliation with the official dedication of the Vietnam Memorial. And through the tears and bitter memories, America's long healing process begins.
Everybody sing! Everybody sing! We got to feel it today, everybody!
A year of violence and war, but 1982 winds to a close with a hope for peace.